Hello, this is John Graves. I was just going to show a way of doing a bit of dynamic type of data within Visual Builder. There may be other ways of doing this, but this is one of the ways I've researched as I was playing around with some of the ways of showing some data in Visual Builder using the internal data objects, but being able to update dashboards as the data change. So I'll show you how this is done. Start off with just building off some basic business object that will be displayed. We'll just create a couple fields in here for a label and a value. Again, this will probably be a much more complex business object. Give it some simple data. Maybe this is dealing with some regions. Starting values here. East and west. So I've just got some basic values here, and I want to build a web page to show that off. So it shows how to show this data. Inside of here, I can just bring in maybe a pie chart. Add data from that sample data business object using the REST service here. Put the values in based on the labels. And we get a basic chart, and if I run it, we'll see the basic data here. But if I change the data, if I make west, for example, have a larger value. If I go back to my screen, nothing's been updated, it's still at 13. I have to do a page refresh to get that data to show up again. And now west is larger, so I'm trying to avoid that page refresh. So if I go back, first thing I want to do is just create a simple button that allows me to do an update on this data. So let's add a button. And we want this update to rerun this. So let's do a click event. In the click event, I'm going to call the same action that the standard data type does by just assigning some values. So what happens here is when I assign a new value to this provider here and give it another filter criteria, for example, I will be able to force it to update this. And so in this case, I'm going to just pass it a simple provider here. Some always true data in the filter criteria, and when that filter updates, it'll update that data in that chart. So I won't go into this here, but I'm basically just saying that if the ID is equal to 0 or not equal to 0, then I want to display it. So all the IDs are greater than 0, so that's easy. So I had this filter criteria in here just to return, and that updates that sample data list service, which will then in turn update the chart data. So now if I go back and run this, see the data. Let's modify one of these values now. Make east much smaller. This data east right now is 22%. If I update, it changes. So now this update changes the filter criteria, which then forces this data to refresh. So now I just want to avoid this button so that whenever the data happens. So the first thing I want to do is create a way of updating this through a WebSocket. So I'm going to add some code to have this listen to a WebSocket, but the WebSocket itself needs to be running somewhere. And so what I did is I deployed a very simple Node.js application in our application container service that allows me to run a REST service to send data to a WebSocket. So I'll show you that data now. So to kind of visualize what's going on here, inside of Visual Builder we have our data object, and we've displayed it in the UI. And we have a little button here that when it's pressed it updates based on the data. What we're going to do is create this REST socket app within an app container that the Visual Builder will connect to initially and listen for changes. And whenever a change happens, automatically update the object here. And then we'll tie that in after testing that just through some curl REST calls here. Tie that into the data objects because we can set up events whenever data changes in the data object to then notify the UI that it needs updating. So first step will be to get this working here. And the app that I created in here, it's pretty simple. Just bring it up a little bit. It is just a Node.js thing that listens for notify. It does take a payload if that is desired to do some routing. Maybe a certain part of the page should be updated based on the data that's passed in. Perhaps different posts would do different things, but I just made it more generic. So this just takes something in, and then based on the number of clients that are currently listening in the WebSockets, it sends that data that's passed into this to all the web clients. So that's the Express side of things, the REST side. And then down below I just have a simple WebSocket server that's listening to the same port, and it just keeps track of all of the clients that are currently connected every time it gets one, and then creates this list of the clients and iterates through those whenever new data is changed. So it's a real simple thing here. I can make this available, but it's quite easy to code this. So here I'm just showing the Oracle Application Container Cloud hosting that VBCS code. It's quite easy to set up here. I just had to create, manifest a couple of things in along with the Java code, and then Node.js code. Create an application that was of type Node.js, gave it some basic parameters, uploaded the archive, and it started running. Once it starts running, you get the URL. So this is where it is running, and was able to just use that within my Visual Builder application. So now that I have this deployed, I need to connect to it when the application first starts. So what I'll do here is go back to my application, go at that top level web application, and inside of here I can take a look at the JavaScript code in here. And so I want to create a function that will allow me to connect to the WebSocket. So I'm just going to build a little function here off of the application module. I'll copy and paste a couple things here to save myself some typing. So what this does is it is an application module prototype function called OpenSocket. It takes an arg that says I'll need that in order to make it work on an event. It just reports itself and makes a call to the WebSocket, secure socket based on that URL from my application deployment. And then I have 3 messages here that I need to define. So an on message, on error, on close, that I can put inside of this app module, as well as 3 different methods. So we'll put in the on message first. And right now, all this is going to do is display some data so we can, or display to the console so we can see that this happened. So that's the on message here. And then we'll create the on error and on close. So the on close will report it, reset the WebSocket to undefined, and then reopen it so that it will create it again. Might be some logic in here to decide if we want to reopen it based on if there is a certain type of error, that kind of thing. We may not want to reopen it, but and then on the error, we'll just print out the error. So if I have this inside of this module, I need it to execute when the system first starts up. And what I'll do to get that to work is start off by creating an action. That will call that module. Just do a return here of nothing. And we don't need to pass any parameters to it because it doesn't use that. And then, now that I have that open socket action, I can create an event when this is loaded on enter to call that when the page is entered, and that's it. So this event will call this action, which will then run this open socket code and make this work. So if we run this now, got the debug window open here. Let's see this here. It just did an open socket and started that listener. And then I'm going to run a real simple curl script here, which will just do a post to that location with some data, which isn't really used in this case. It is a post, and that will end up calling the WebSocket here, and we should see an on message, which we didn't. So let's take a look at that and see why we haven't done that. Let's just reload this page and make sure. Call it again. Okay, that didn't work, so let's take a look. Back at the code. I think, oh, here's my problem. I have my brackets incorrect. So I have to put this inside of here. Okay, there we go. Now I have my three distinct functions here, so let's try that again. So now I have my listener, call my REST service, and you can see that the message is there. So if I just do that again so you can see it. Make this a little less verbose. Drop it down here so we can see both screens. Run that. We can see it was called again. So this message call is being called for this socket. Now we just need to tie that in and make it do the update button for us. So in order to do that, go back into the code, and then just in this event here, show a couple things. One is that you can get the data in JSON format if you want. So that's an example here. We can write it out, the data that comes in. So more likely there would be some kind of logic here to define what should get updated, or maybe the data that's coming in here becomes the data that's being updated. But in our case, we're going to just do a call to do a click, and the button that we want to use is based on, go back to the code here, this is the button that I press. It's got this identifier that was generated for it. So I just use that, go back, and all this does is says on that page, click the button for me. So now if I run it again, see it's listening to socket. I can run my curl command. Of course that's not going to update anything because the data hasn't changed. So let's go change some data. Modify east to be a larger portion. I go back. So east is the yellow here. Without clicking the update button, I can just call my curl command. And that updated it as if I had pressed the button automatically. So that is just able to update it in that method. Now what I want to do is the last kind of step where I can bring up my PowerPoint. So the last bit here, I just tested this piece here. I want to call that when the data has changed. In order to do that, I want to go back in. There's a way inside of my data objects to set up business rules for triggers. So I'm going to set up a trigger, and this trigger will do before the update. We can do it for inserts and deletes as well. There's a few other options here for removes and commits. Now there's a little bit of a race condition on here on the before update, where this gets triggered just as the update's happening, but in our case that's okay because it takes just a fraction of a second to go on that round trip to then refresh that data, and by that time that update's completely done. So this is the trigger for the before update, and then in here we want to set up to always execute. So you could do some conditions on the data itself. Maybe I don't want to update it all the time, but only in certain cases, or have some custom code to define when I do these executes, but I'm going to do it all the time. And then in here I have quite a few options to add some actions for doing some pre-work that would normally be done on the business objects and the data. So in our case, we're going to do other, and we're going to do some scripting in here and just write a script. Inside of here, we're going to call our update REST service, and then I'll talk about the code in just a minute. I'll just put something here. Just so I can save. So what we want to do inside of here is call a REST service. Now there are ways in Groovy to just directly call REST services, but I wanted to do it by creating and setting up a service connection. So inside of my service connection, I created this socket update that points to the URL that is being hosted by my application builder. So that's this one here that we called through our curl script. And then there was a single endpoint that was notify, and it takes some data, but that doesn't matter too much because this is ignored. But this is just like the curl script with the response and testing and all that. So this here is a call to that REST service, which then comes back and does the update as if I was pressing the button. And so this is what I want to call. And there's a bit of Groovy script you can do to make that happen. There is a blog that talks about it. It's a little bit different now in this version than what the blog talks about, but I'll give you the example here. So if we just go to bring up some sample code here, there's a call here called new service, which gets a reference to this name, and that name is the name of that services here. So whenever I call this service name here, it's actually the service ID. And just be careful because oftentimes it will lowercase the first thing. So you want that name on service ID and put that into that first call. And that gets you a reference to that service. So once you have a reference to that service, then you just need to create some data, because this is a post method. In our case, we're just giving it some dummy data. It doesn't really matter. There's some JSON code here. And then we need to make a call to the service and pretty much ignore the response in our case, because we're just literally pressing the update button for ourselves. So here's the call. Now, the only thing that kind of is different than what you would see in the blogs that are out there for doing this in Groovy is right here. The blogs talk about just doing a post, because in the original VB call, you couldn't set up different operations for your REST services. Now you can, and so you need to put, instead of post, you need to put the ID of the operator. And so this for me is post notify, and we can find that if I go back to my service definition. Inside of my endpoint, I have this here, right here. That endpoint ID is the method that's called to call this particular operation. So if I had other resources here, if I didn't just have the notify, but if I wanted to create other things on here besides just the notify, then I would be able to have several operations here and then call the correct one based on the endpoint ID, as if it's just a method on the call. So if I go back to my Groovy, that's what this does here, and that calls and makes that round trip to emulate the update button. Alright, so that's done. We can restart all of this code here. Go back to my web page. Start this. And we have our data here, and we can I've got some debug. Let me just bring up the debugger inside of your Chrome. You can modify this and do more tools, developer tools, and this shows you what's kind of going on. Here we can see it open the socket and start a listener, and when I do my curl script to call to update this business object, and let me just explain that quickly. Inside of your business objects, you have the ability to do the REST services as defined here. So if I wanted to do a patch call, here and update a particular identifier and do it through this REST call. And you can get the full REST service by looking here, and this is the starting point for your curl call, all the way over here, and then that endpoint there, sample data, can be followed by an identifier, and then you can do a patch. If you do a patch operation, then it updates that. That'll kick the trigger off, which will then ideally make the web page update. So if I come back and I've got some code here, my curl command, and I'm going to patch, then I'm going to modify and update an ID to be value 200. I think it's 200 now. Let me make it 2000. And so this ID 1 represents north, which is the value here on 0. So if I do this curl command, this will end up making a call. We can see the updated message here, and we can get the new value here. So if I run that command again with a different value, let's go back to 200. So I'm going to do this again with 200. We can see it updates and the real time there. So this is a way to make the graphs or maybe tables or these kind of things update automatically as the data behind the table works. Now there's a bit of a lag, there's a round trip that's happening here, so you certainly wouldn't want to do it if the data is changing incredibly quickly. But if the data is changing occasionally and you just want a real-time kind of dashboard to be able to display, this could be a good solution for you. And it's a good exercise in just learning how these pieces work within Visual Builder. I hope this has been helpful.